because they're quite ignorant of our history. And I mean that in the truest sense of the word, not in a derogatory way. Ignorance is a lack of knowledge. And, some people do a double take when I tell them I teach African-American history, but it's a topic I've been passionate about for a long time. And I've been teaching that class to high school kids for 17 years. So we've gone back and tried to teach the history, to tell the truth about it so that we can have greater understanding and move forward there. So that's been a real key point to open people's eyes to say, wow, I've never heard about that. I've never heard about the lost cause. I've never heard about, how the segregation took place in churches or whatever. So I think that's a big point. The other thing is we're creating a space, frankly, where white and black people are coming together and they're hearing each other's perspective and voices. And one of the nice things about Merides is it closed at 9 and we made sure we finished by 8:30 so people could break bread together, so they could keep talking, they could keep carrying on the conversations. And so we've seen relationships build, cross-racial relationships that frankly a lot of people haven't experienced before. The other thing that I think is interesting, there's quite a few families in Williamson County who have adopted children of color, whether they're from the United States or from Africa. And a lot of them were feeling this weird duality and tension with some of the things that were happening, and even as it affected their children, and they didn't understand it fully as white people. And so they were coming, I think, to connect with people who could help them.
It's interesting you talked about history. You're a Bible and history teacher at Brentwood Academy, and I saw that you were quoted as saying, history is about telling the truth, and we have to tell the truth first. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of times the truth was not told. So that's heavy, but I'm sure it's accurate. And so what do you mean by that, and how heavy is that?
Yeah, it can be very heavy. So I live in Franklin, and I'm the 9th generation of my family to live in the city of Franklin. My children are the 10th. I have 6 children. And so my family goes back where they were part of the Confederacy. My family in the 1840s was the largest slaveholding family in Williamson County, documented, and so that's part of my history. That's a heavy, not very pretty piece of the history. And I just think there's a lot of things, and I'll try not to get too detailed here, but the way the Civil War, even slavery in many ways, was taught in the South. And when I say was taught, I mean even into my generation. Okay, I won't reveal my age, but this is not ancient history here in terms of things like the idea that this lost cause narrative, this glorifying of the South and the Confederacy, and how this idea that even that most slaves were really happy with their state in life, and they did not fight back or fight against the change of their oppressors, and their masters didn't beat them and mistreat them. And so that narrative carried through. And even the idea that Reconstruction, many in the South were taught, and in textbooks, I'm talking about in schools, were taught things like Reconstruction was bad. You had these, the Northerners or the Yankees encroaching and trying to tell us we need to live our lives. And so those narratives have carried into, dare I say, the 21st century. So we just try to go back and teach that story, teach that our history in a true and real way so that we can learn from it. The truth does set us free. And so I think that needs to be a starting point.
So the truth does set us free. And then there are those who would say, okay, that's the past, and they do get very uncomfortable when you start talking about your family history, that you owned slaves. Well, that's the past. That's not the present. What can I do? And so what is kind of the message? What is tangible? What can people do?
Well, I always watch the quote by Faulkner about the past being not even past. It's really the present and can often be the future. But I think there's a lot of things. I think the starting point for doing is to listen and to learn. And, I think about a guy like Paul from the Bible, when he had this conversion experience, he spent 15 years sitting at the feet of the disciples, learning about the teachings and the ways of Jesus before he goes on his missionary journeys, before he begins to be this great teacher himself, even though he was already a rabbi and knew the Old Testament inside and out. So I think this a posture of listening and learning is really important, I think, for white people. And so there's so many great resources out there to read. And, for those who are Christian that are tackling this issue from a Christian perspective as well, that are looking at even how the church has been complicit in some of these issues. So I think that's the starting point. And then you have so many areas of advocacy that we could talk about, because even though most of our laws have changed, and I think we can say things are better today than they were in 1955, certainly in 1855, there are still systems of oppression that still linger for people of color that can be dealt with. And that's obviously a lot of the conversation that's happening nationally, even as protests and things like that continue.
There in Williamson County, are you seeing buy-in from churches? Are churches actively participating in this? And then my next question is going to be, do you feel like churches are being radical enough? I mean, there's no question Jesus was radical. Are churches radical enough? And I know Martin Luther King was concerned about that in his time, and I think it's a worthy question for all times. But so both those questions, are churches participating, and are churches, in your view, radical enough?
Well, I would say that, and generally speaking, no, they haven't been, but I am encouraged, and we are encouraged at the number of pastors. I mean, we were blown away at how many pastors have come to our gatherings, which is the name for our big meeting, that have come to taking part in our book study. I'm doing a book study on white fragility, which is not an easy book to wade through, especially if you're new to this conversation. But a lot of pastors are engaging with that. They're taking it back to their congregations. They're making it a point to emphasize, even in Sunday sermons. Book studies are happening. There's a great book that's written by a guy named African-American scholar named Jamar Tisby, called The Color of Compromise. And it's all about the white church and its sort of complicity with racism. I mean, he has a hopeful ending, but it's a hard read because you're reading about that history. So I say that because there's local churches in Franklin who are doing book studies on that. They're having conversations. I know you guys mentioned it from Anthony's talk when he was on your show, just about Sunday mornings being segregated, and we live in a majority white city in Franklin, in our county, in Williamson County, and so most of these churches are all white. So so we are seeing open hearts, I think, and open eyes in some cases for the first time. But this is really early, and I think it's the starting point, and we'll see where it goes from here.
How do you define white fragility? That is a term that's out there. I know it's a book. How do you define that? That's a phrase that's out there, and how do you define that? Yeah, that's interesting.
Well, absolutely. Well, the subtitle of the book is "Why Is It So Hard for White People to Talk About Race?" And so that's sort of the starting point or the premise, that there is this difficulty and obviously we're speaking in some generalities here, but for white people to engage in this conversation, whether it's because of, they think that, or we think that everything is equal now and our history doesn't matter, or maybe we weren't taught our history well enough. I think so many, because of our segregated lives, we don't really know people from a different race or somebody who's Black. So I think that the idea of fragility is just, it's so hard. And Anthony will talk a lot, and I don't mean to quote him, but I think he would be okay with that, about how often he feels like he has to package things in such a way, delicately gentle, so that the white hearer can hear it. And I can speak and use my hands right now and raise my voice a little bit, and nobody's going to say that I'm an angry white man. He can do the same thing, and he can get written off as an angry Black man. And that's just a small example of how sometimes white people can be so fragile. And I think we can look for ways or excuses to disengage with the conversation. You write somebody off, or they're angry. I mean, Dr. King was written off by the evangelical church because he used the social gospel, or he went to a liberal seminary. Well, most of the conservative seminaries wouldn't have accepted him at that time because of the color of his skin. So anyway, it's not a new phenomenon.
Fascinating. All right, I want to take a break and then come back and talk about where we may be going in the future, big picture. But we'll take a break. Be back right after this.
Sure.